Okay, starting on the very front end of the harness where it's going to be super long, we got this coolant temp sensor in the head. This one's for the gauge. It doesn't actually feed the ECU information, it just feeds your gauge in your car. Following the harness up, we have our cam sensor, crank sensor. They can only plug in one way. Up here is our MAP sensor, mass airflow. Sorry, MAF, not MAP. And then we have all these ground wires that are all bundled up together, and they're held on by this 13mm stud. There's 3 ring terminals. Make sure those get grounded back on the head. Not sure how grounds work on aluminum, but I guess it works. Then the harness runs up to injectors 1, 3, 5, 7. We have a stray wire right here. Probably went to some kind of emission system that I disconnected a while ago. Then the harness goes into, it splits off into 2 different sections like a Y harness. Oh, actually technically 3. This third one's super simple. It's for the coil packs and the ECU harness. So set that aside. But right here where it splits off into this Y, it comes down into this oil pressure sender. Also for the gauge, it just feeds your gauge. Then it goes down to this big harness. This is for the whole transmission. So we'll worry about that later. On this other side of the Y where it comes over here, we have a vacuum line coming out of right here. Super important to remember. That vacuum line goes into the top right here. Probably doesn't matter which one, but make sure that gets plugged in. That bottom vacuum line is not connected to the harness, but it feeds up here and it's for the fuel pressure regulator. Then it splits off into another Y. There's a harness sitting right here. Also emissions related, don't use that anymore. Comes up here, emissions related harness. It's still plugged in just because it's there. Injectors 2 and 4. And then it splits off right here into this one. Also not being used, another emissions related. Following it up, we have a green sensor. Manifold absolute pressure, MAP sensor. Then followed up a little bit more. It comes down here. This one plugs into the power steering pump. This one plugs into the AC, so they're gonna hang down here. Then we have this one other strand in here. Kind of tricky, but we have a throttle position sensors up here. This one is an idle air control valve sensor. And then you have it come down a little bit further. Let's see. What are these for? This one goes to the water pump for the ECU to know the temperature, to adjust for fuel, because the hotter the engine is, the less fuel it needs. The colder the engine is, the denser the air, the more fuel it's going to need. And then this little one right here goes to the intake air temp. It hooks up to the intake way up here. On the ram air intake, it's going to hook up right there. This is a WS6, so it does have ram air, but if you don't have a WS6, there should be a sensor somewhere along your intake ducting that reads the air temp going in, so that's going to be this little gray one here. And then other than that, on the back of this, where we split off from this Y to follow it, comes down here. There's another vacuum line here, super important. I'll have to actually include it in the video where that goes when I reassemble the engine, but it goes into the engine bay on this, somewhere in the engine bay. I'll show you later. And then you have more ECU harnesses. You have AC line. There's a pressure sensor for the AC line. That one hooks up to in the engine bay as well. My whole AC system is still hooked up in the engine bay. I didn't want to disconnect it because then you're going to discharge the system. Really bad for the ozone if you don't have the right machine to do it. And then this harness right here with the grommet on it, this one's going to go into through the firewall. That's what the grommet's for. And under the passenger kick panel, it's going to plug into all those. And then you have this one other section of the harness that runs down on the bottom of the engine. It's going to go down past the headers. It runs down here. This one right here is the stock crank sensor, but I have the 24x conversion kit, so I didn't reuse the stock sensor, but it would just come up here and plug in there. And then you have the purple wire is the power wire for the starter. The black wire is a ground for the block. It just grounds right up here. I have another big battery cable that's also grounded. That bolt right there is actually for the dipstick tube that I already took out. But this ground cable here is where the ground on this harness goes. And then a few more harnesses. This one here, this weird one, is a knock sensor. Right there is a knock sensor. Already unplugged that. Excuse me, this is actually an O2 sensor harness, not a crank sensor. This long one on the end here with the purple is for the crank sensor that goes up on the front of the engine here. So don't forget that that's going to be an O2 sensor.